When we hear the name Richard the Lionheart, what comes to mind? A legendary king, clad in shining armor, fearlessly charging into battle. He's the very picture of a medieval hero, a symbol of courage and honor. But history, as we know, is rarely so black and white. Behind every gleaming legend, there are shadows, hidden stories of suffering, fear, and the countless people who were left voiceless. The Crusades, the very stage for Richard's fame, were not just a series of glorious battles. They were a brutal reality for thousands of civilians caught in the crossfire. Among these were countless women, whose lives were irrevocably shattered when they became captives of war. Today, we're going to peel back the layers of legend and look at the real, documented fate of these women during Richard the Lionheart's campaigns. This isn't about shock value or fantasy. It's about uncovering the stark, historical truth. So, what really happened to a woman captured during the Third Crusade? The first and most immediate reality was the loss of everything. Her home, her family, her freedom. She became property. Historical accounts from both Christian and Muslim chroniclers describe the process. After a city or a fortress was taken, the victors would divide the spoils. This didn't just mean gold and weapons. It included people. Women were often seen as a valuable part of the loot. Their fate was then decided by their captors. Some were held for ransom, especially if they came from wealthy or noble families. A high-ranking woman could be a strategic bargaining chip, exchanged for important prisoners or a large sum of money. This was, in a grim sense, one of the better outcomes. It offered a sliver of hope for a return to some semblance of their former life, though the psychological trauma would be immense. But for the vast majority of captive women, those without wealth or status, the future was far bleaker. Many were forced into servitude. They became unpaid laborers, cooks, and servants in the camps and households of the Crusader knights and soldiers. Their lives were ones of endless toil and constant vulnerability. They had no rights, no protection. The chronicles of the time, while often focusing on the deeds of great men, occasionally give us glimpses into this reality. They mention women being marched along with the army, carrying supplies. Their lives completely at the mercy of their new masters. This forced servitude was a common practice on all sides of the conflict, a brutal but accepted part of medieval warfare. The individual suffering of these women was simply considered a consequence of defeat. Beyond ransom and servitude, there was another, darker path. Many women were sold in open slave markets. Cities like Acre and Tyre, major Crusader strongholds, had markets where human beings were bought and sold. A woman's price depended on her age, health, and perceived beauty. She could be sold to a soldier, a merchant, or anyone with the means to buy her. Once sold, her life was no longer her own. She could be taken far from her homeland, never to see her family again. The emotional devastation of being treated as mere chattel is hard for us to even comprehend today. For these women, their identity was erased, replaced by a price tag. And for many, this led to a life of forced concubinage. The line between a servant and a concubine was often non-existent. Lacking any legal or social protection, captive women were extremely vulnerable to assault and exploitation by their captors. This was a grim, unspoken reality of the Crusades. While the official goal was religious, the human cost, particularly for women, was devastatingly personal and physical. So when we look back at the towering figure of Richard the Lionheart, it's crucial to remember the full picture. The glory of his victories was built upon a foundation of immense human suffering. The stories of the captive women are not just a footnote to his legend. They are a vital part of the history of the Crusades. They remind us that war is never just about kings and knights in shining armor. It's about ordinary people, families, and lives torn apart. By acknowledging their stories, we gain a more honest and complete understanding of the past, moving beyond the simple myths to see the complex and often tragic human reality. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving deep into the story of one of history's most legendary figures, Richard the Lionheart. You've probably heard the name, right? It conjures up images of a valiant knight, a Crusader king, the epitome of chivalry. But was the real man as heroic as the legend? Was he a great king for England, or just a great warrior? Let's find out. Richard I was born in 1157 the third son of King Henry II of England and the formidable Eleanor of Aquitaine. Growing up, he wasn't even expected to be king. His older brother, Henry the Young King, was the heir, so Richard's early life was focused on something else: warfare. His mother made him the Duke of Aquitaine in modern-day France, a notoriously rebellious territory. From a young age, Richard was constantly putting down revolts and fighting to secure his lands. This is where he earned his stripes. He became a brilliant military strategist and a fearsome fighter, tall, strong, and incredibly charismatic. He lived and breathed the battlefield. It was his home, but his family life was complicated, to say the least. The Plantagenets were famous for their infighting. Richard and his brothers frequently rebelled against their own father, often encouraged by their mother Eleanor. It was a constant power struggle. Imagine your family dinners involving plotting to overthrow your dad for his kingdom. After years of conflict and the deaths of his older brothers, Richard finally teamed up with the King of France, Philip Augustus, to defeat his own father. In 1189, Henry II died broken-hearted and defeated, and Richard, at the age of 31, became King of England. So, he's king. Time to settle down and govern. Right? Wrong. Richard had one thing on his mind: the Crusades. Jerusalem had fallen to the great Muslim leader, Saladin, and the call went out across Europe for a new crusade to reclaim the Holy Land. For Richard, this was the ultimate calling. It was a chance for glory, for piety, and for what he did best: fighting. Being King of England was almost a side gig, a way to fund his real passion. He spent only a few months of his entire 10-year reign actually in England. His first order of business was to raise an obscene amount of money for his crusade. He sold off lands, titles, and government positions to the highest bidder. He famously joked that he would have sold London itself if he could find a buyer. He taxed his people heavily, scraped together every penny he could, and assembled a massive army and fleet. Then, in 1190, he set off on the Third Crusade, alongside his rival, King Philip of France. The journey itself was an adventure. He conquered Sicily along the way and then Cyprus, which he sold to the Knights Templar. He was making his mark everywhere he went. When he finally arrived in the Holy Land, he was a superstar. The Crusader forces, who had been stuck besieging the city of Acre for 2 years, were overjoyed. Richard's arrival, with his fresh troops and siege engines, turned the tide. Acre fell soon after. The Lionheart had arrived, and his reputation was already legendary. In battle, Richard was truly in his element. He led from the front, inspiring his men with his incredible bravery. He fought in the thick of the action, a terrifying figure to his enemies. Even the Muslim chroniclers, who were his foes, wrote about him with a kind of grudging respect. Takait, Malakrik, O King Richard, and described his ferocity and courage. There's a famous story about Richard and Saladin. During one battle, Richard's horse was killed from under him. Seeing this, Saladin, in a remarkable act of chivalry, sent 2 fresh horses to his enemy, saying it was not right for such a great king to fight on foot. It shows the mutual respect these 2 great leaders had for each other. Richard's greatest military achievement during the Crusade was the Battle of Arsif. He marched his army south, from Acre towards Jaffa, all while being constantly harassed by Saladin's forces. Saladin's plan was to provoke the Crusaders into breaking formation and then destroy them. But Richard's discipline was ironclad. He held his army together under immense pressure. Finally, when the moment was right, he unleashed a devastating cavalry charge that shattered Saladin's army. It was a tactical masterpiece and a huge victory. However, the ultimate prize, Jerusalem, remained out of reach. Richard marched his army to within sight of the city twice, but both times, he decided against a siege. He was a realist. He knew that even if they could capture Jerusalem, they wouldn't be able to hold it once the main Crusader army went home. It was a heartbreaking decision for him. The man who had dedicated everything to this cause had to turn back. Instead, he negotiated a treaty with Saladin. The treaty allowed Christian pilgrims unarmed access to Jerusalem and kept a strip of coastline in Christian hands. It wasn't the total victory he wanted, but it was a pragmatic solution. With the treaty signed, Richard, who was now ill and hearing troubling news from home, decided it was time to leave. But his adventures were far from over. The journey back was even more dangerous than the crusade itself. He was shipwrecked in the Adriatic Sea and had to travel overland through the territory of his enemy, Duke Leopold of Austria. Remember the siege of Acre? Richard had insulted Leopold by tearing down his banner. Well, Leopold hadn't forgotten. Richard was captured near Vienna, disguised as a pilgrim, and thrown into a dungeon. He became the most famous political prisoner in Europe. Duke Leopold handed him over to the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry VI, who demanded a colossal ransom for his release. 150,000 marks. That was an astronomical sum. Several times the annual income of the English crown. Back in England, his brother John was trying to seize the throne, but their mother, the incredible Eleanor of Aquitaine, sprang into action. At 70 years old, she traveled across her domains, raising the money. The English people were taxed to their limits once again to pay for a king they barely knew. After more than a year in captivity, the ransom was paid, and Richard was finally freed. He made a brief, triumphant return to England in 1194. He was crowned a second time, just to remind everyone, especially his brother John, who was in charge. He forgave John, supposedly saying, "He is only a child who has had evil counselors." After just a couple of months, he left England again. This time, for good. He would never set foot in his kingdom again. The last 5 years of his life were spent doing what he always did, fighting in France. He was battling his old rival, King Philip, to win back the lands and castles he had lost while he was on crusade and in prison. During this time, he built one of the most advanced military fortifications of its day, the Chateau Galliard in Normandy. It was his masterpiece, a testament to his genius as a military engineer. Then, in 1199, the end came in a strange and almost anticlimactic way. Richard was besieging a minor, insignificant castle called Chelester. The story goes that he was there to claim a treasure hoard found by a local peasant. One evening, as he was walking around the castle walls without his full armor, a boy defending the castle fired a crossbow bolt from the ramparts. It struck Richard in the shoulder. The wound itself wasn't immediately fatal, but the surgeon who removed the bolt botched the job, and the wound became gangrenous. Richard knew he was dying. In a final act that cemented his chivalric legend, he summoned the boy who had shot him. Instead of punishing him, Richard forgave him, gave him a bag of silver, and ordered him to be set free. Unfortunately, after Richard died, his captains ignored his final wish and had the boy brutally executed. Richard the Lionheart died on April 6, 1199, at the age of 41. So, how should we remember him? As a king, he was pretty terrible for England. He drained the country of its wealth, spent almost no time there, and saw it merely as a source of funding for his foreign wars. But as a warrior, a crusader, and a figure of chivalry, his reputation is unmatched. He was a product of his time, a man who embodied the medieval ideal of the warrior. His courage was legendary, his military skill was undeniable, and his story is one of the most incredible adventures in all of history. He was less an English king and more a force of nature, a lion on the world stage. What do you think? Was Richard a hero or a neglectful king? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Thanks so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this deep dive into history, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more. We'll see you in the next one. Have you ever pictured knights in shining armor, riding off to a noble war for faith and glory? That's the image many of us have of the Crusades. But what if I told you the reality was far more complex and infinitely more tragic? For nearly 2 centuries, a series of religious wars reshaped the world, leaving a legacy of conflict that echoes even today. Let's peel back the layers of myth and legend to uncover the true story of the Crusades. It all began in the late 11th century. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos sent a desperate plea to the West. The Seljuk Turks, a powerful Muslim dynasty, were expanding their territory and threatening the heart of his empire, Constantinople. He asked for military aid. In response, Pope Urban II delivered a sermon in Clermont, France, that would set Europe ablaze. He called upon the knights and nobles of Christendom to take up the cross, march to the east, and reclaim the Holy Land, especially Jerusalem, from Muslim control. He promised remission of sins for those who undertook this holy pilgrimage, a powerful motivator in a deeply religious age. The response was overwhelming. far beyond what anyone could have imagined. This wasn't just a mission for trained knights, it was a mass movement. The First Crusade saw a mix of professional soldiers, led by powerful nobles, and a less organized wave known as the People's Crusade, made up of peasants and commoners. Their journey was marked by both fervent faith and brutal violence. As they marched east, some groups tragically attacked Jewish communities in Europe, a dark prelude to the bloodshed that would follow. Against all odds, the main Crusader army reached its goal. In 1099, after a brutal siege, they captured Jerusalem. The victory was celebrated in Europe, but it came at a horrific cost, with the city's inhabitants suffering a terrible massacre. This victory established 4 Crusader states in the Levant, little Christian kingdoms surrounded by a sea of Muslim powers. For the next 200 years, the story of the Crusades would be one of constant struggle to defend these territories. The Second Crusade was launched after the fall of Edessa, one of the Crusader states, but it ended in a dismal failure, achieving nothing. It was the rise of a legendary Muslim leader, Saladin, that truly turned the tide. A brilliant military strategist and a respected ruler, Saladin united Muslim forces in 1187, recaptured Jerusalem after the decisive Battle of Hattin. Unlike the Crusader conquest, 88 years earlier, Saladin spared the city's population, offering them the chance to ransom themselves. The fall of Jerusalem shocked Europe and sparked the Third Crusade, often called the Crusade of Kings. It was led by Europe's most powerful monarchs, Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, Philip Augustus of France, and Richard the Lionheart of England. Despite the star power, it was a troubled campaign. Barbarossa drowned on the way, and Philip returned to France early. This left Richard the Lionheart to face Saladin alone. Their rivalry has become the stuff of legend. They were fierce enemies on the battlefield, but also shared a mutual respect. After years of fighting, they couldn't dislodge one another. Richard failed to retake Jerusalem, but he did secure a treaty that allowed unarmed Christian pilgrims safe passage to the Holy City. It was a compromise, not a victory. What followed were more crusades, each with its own strange and often disastrous story. The Fourth Crusade is perhaps the most infamous, diverted from its goal by political intrigue and a lack of funds. The Crusader army ended up sacking not a Muslim city, but the Christian city of Constantinople, the very capital they were originally meant to protect. This act fatally weakened the Byzantine Empire and created a deep, lasting rift between Western and Eastern Christianity. There was even a so-called Children's Crusade, a tragic and poorly documented movement where thousands of young people naively set off to peacefully convert Muslims, only to be sold into slavery or perish from hardship. So, what was the long-term impact of these centuries of holy war? The Crusades failed in their primary objective. The Holy Land remained under Muslim control. However, their consequences were profound. They fostered deep-seated animosity and mistrust between Christians and Muslims. But they also paradoxically increased contact and exchange. Europeans were exposed to new goods, ideas, and technologies from the East. From sugar and spices to advances in mathematics and medicine, this interaction helped spark changes in European society that would eventually contribute to the Renaissance. The Crusades also centralized power in Europe, strengthening monarchies and the papacy, which could now command vast international armies. The story of the Crusades is a powerful reminder of how religion can be used to inspire both incredible devotion and terrible violence. It's a complex saga of faith, greed, ambition, and cruelty. The shining armor of the knights often concealed a much darker reality for the countless ordinary people Christian, Muslim, and Jewish who were caught in the crossfire. Thank you for joining me on this journey back in time. If you found this interesting, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more deep dives into history. See you next time. Ever wondered what it was really like to be a soldier in the Middle Ages? Forget this shiny armor and epic movie battles for a second. The reality was a lot grittier, a lot messier, and frankly, a lot less organized than you might think. Unlike today's professional, highly trained military forces, medieval armies were a chaotic mix of people. You had knights, sure, but also mercenaries, conscripted peasants, and a whole bunch of folks just hoping to get paid or find some loot. Discipline. It was a far cry from modern standards. Soldiers weren't drilling in perfect formation day in and day out. For many, the army was a temporary job, Their main loyalty was often to their direct lord or the commander who promised them coin, not necessarily to a king or a country. This meant that if the money dried up, so did their willingness to fight. It wasn't uncommon for entire mercenary companies to switch sides. If the enemy offered a better deal, life wasn't lived in a comfortable barracks. Home was a sprawling, makeshift camp that moved with the army. Imagine thousands of people, soldiers, servants, merchants, cooks, and countless others who followed the army for protection or profit, living in tents or simple huts. It was crowded, noisy, and dirty. Sanitation was practically non-existent, and disease could sweep through a camp faster than any enemy, often killing more soldiers than actual combat. So, how did this massive mobile city feed itself? Not with carefully planned supply lines like we have today. The primary method was called foraging, which is a polite word for taking whatever you needed from the surrounding countryside. When an army marched through a territory, whether it was friendly or hostile, it was like a swarm of locusts. They would strip fields of crops, seize livestock, and empty villages of food, wine, and anything else of value. This practice, known as Chibaoshi, was a deliberate tactic of war. The goal was to terrorize the local population and destroy the enemy's economic base. For civilians, the sight of an approaching army was terrifying. It meant their homes could be burned, their livelihoods destroyed, and their lives put in grave danger. There was no clear line between soldier and civilian. If you were in the path of war, you were part of it, whether you wanted to be or not. Villages and towns would pay protection money to armies just to be left alone. And what about battles? They were brutal, chaotic affairs. Forget elegant sword duels. It was a shoving, hacking, and stabbing match. The noise would have been deafening, men yelling, metal clashing, the wounded screaming. And if you were captured, your fate depended on your status. A wealthy knight might be ransomed back to his family for a hefty sum, but a common foot soldier, you were more likely to be killed on the spot, or, if you were lucky, simply stripped of your gear and left to fend for yourself. After a campaign, the army would often disband. Mercenaries would look for their next contract, and peasant levies would return to their farms, hopefully in time for the harvest. For many, being a soldier was a seasonal, dangerous, and uncertain way of life, a world away from the romanticized image of medieval warfare. It was a tough, brutal existence defined by constant movement, scavenging for survival, and the ever— Have you ever wondered what it was really like to be captured in ancient times? Forget the sanitized movie scenes. The reality was a terrifying lottery where your life hung by a thread. The moment you were taken, your identity was stripped away. You were no longer a soldier, a merchant, a farmer, or even a child. You were simply a captive, a piece of property. Imagine being a soldier, defeated on the battlefield. One moment you're fighting for your king and country, the next you're chained, paraded through the streets of an enemy city as a trophy of war. Your fate, it could be a lifetime of hard labor in a quarry, chained to an oar in a galley, or even being forced to fight to the death as a gladiator for the entertainment of your captors. Your military skills, once a source of pride, now meant nothing more than your physical capacity to endure suffering. Or picture yourself as a merchant, traveling along a trade route. You're carrying silks, spices, valuable goods. Suddenly, your caravan is ambushed. Bandits or enemy patrols swarm you. Your guards are overwhelmed, and you're taken. For you, there's a glimmer of hope, but it's a costly one. You're a target for ransom. A message is sent to your family or your guild. Pay a hefty sum, or you'll never be seen again. Weeks, maybe months, pass in a dark, cold cell. Every day is a torment of uncertainty. Will your family be able to raise the money? Will they even receive the message? Your wealth, which once gave you status, now becomes the price tag on your own life. But what if you had no wealth, no status? What if you were just a villager, tilling your field or tending to your home? Raiding parties could descend at any moment. Your village would be burned, your life turned upside down in an instant. Men, women, and even children were swept up and taken. You wouldn't be held for ransom. You were seen as a resource. Strong men were forced into grueling labor, building monuments or fortifications for their new masters. Women and older children were often forced into domestic servitude, their days filled with endless chores and the constant fear of abuse, their previous lives, their families, their homes. All just a distant, painful memory. The capture of children was perhaps the most heartbreaking of all. Snatched from their parents' arms, they faced a future of unimaginable horror. Some were sold into servitude, their childhood stolen from them. Others were forcibly assimilated into the captor's culture, their names changed, their language forbidden, their entire identity erased and replaced. They were raised to forget where they came from, to serve the very people who destroyed their families. It was a form of cultural and psychological warfare, ensuring the next generation would have no memory of their heritage. So, how could a captive ever hope to be free? It was a complex and often cruel game of chance. Money was the most straightforward path. If your family had wealth, they could buy your freedom. Power was another way. A high-ranking soldier or a nobleman might be exchanged for a captive of similar status from the other side. This was a political negotiation, where human lives were bargaining chips. But for most, freedom depended on sheer, dumb luck. Perhaps your captor died, and in the ensuing chaos, you managed to escape. Maybe a sympathetic guard took pity on you and looked the other way. Or perhaps the empire that held you captive simply collapsed, and the gates were thrown open. These were rare, almost miraculous events. Most captives never saw their homes again. They died in servitude, their names and stories lost to history. The experience of captivity left deep, permanent scars, not just on the individuals, but on entire societies. It fueled cycles of revenge, with each side seeking to inflict the same suffering on the other. It destabilized regions, disrupted trade, and left a legacy of fear and mistrust that could last for generations. The stories of these captives are a sobering reminder of the brutal reality of the past, a world where freedom was not a right, but a privilege, often bought with money, power, or a desperate roll of the dice. Thanks for watching. If you found this glimpse into the past interesting, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories that history often forgets. See you next time.